Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is Carl Bernstein. He's a notable journalist and author who shared a Pulitzer Prize with Bob Woodwards for their Watergate coverage with the Washington Post in the 1970s. His latest book is entitled A Woman in Charge: The Life of Hillary Rodham Clinton, now out in paperback. He's here to discuss it with us today, as well as to share some of his thoughts on the recent 2008 electoral season. Carl Bernstein, welcome.
Good to be here.
I was wondering if you could just give us some of your overall impressions of this very historic election season. I watched some snippets of you on CNN, and I could tell you were very fascinated by this particular election. What are some of your impressions?
Well, I grew up in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, when it was a segregated town. I went to segregated public schools in the nation's capital. My parents took me to be on picket lines to integrate the swimming pools in the capital of the United States. So to be alive in a period when an African American can run for the President of the United States with a real chance of winning was extraordinary, assuming he stood for the right things. So to watch this process unfold, and particularly as the biographer of Hillary Clinton, unauthorized, whom I had every expectation would be the nominee of the Democratic Party, and thought that I knew pretty much all there was to know about her, and to watch her stumble and not know how to confront Barack Obama. And one of the things that was most interesting to me is that whatever one thinks of the Clintons, probably the thing that they have been best about through their lives since they are teenagers, both of them, Bill and Hillary, has been their understanding of the tragedy of race in America, and what race and our racial problems and divisions and slavery and its legacy have done to this country. They understood it as young people. They were deeply influenced by Martin Luther King. Bill Clinton was a Southern governor committed to ending the horrors of that legacy. And both of them dreamed of the day when an African American could be President of the United States. What neither of them dreamed was it would happen on their watch. So to watch Bill and Hillary deal and very unsuccessfully with the dynamic, because obviously both of them knew this was part of what they were up against, and it was the unstated aspect. On the air, I tried to talk about it some. In fact, just in the terms that I just stated, I said, look, this is their worst nightmare, because they can't quite address this phenomenon, which is something they had hoped for all their lives. So they had to go elsewhere to try and discredit Obama, some of which was legitimate, and some of which I think voters found was not legitimate, Democratic voters. And I guess I was probably one of the first to really talk about Hillary Clinton running a negative campaign. And we saw evidence of that, particularly after the campaign was over, in the memos of her campaign hierarchy. Mark Penn, really the most important figure in her campaign, an extension of Bill and Hillary Clinton, writing memos to Hillary Clinton saying you have to paint this guy as un-American. And she didn't just say, Mark Penn, get the hell out of here, you're no longer a part of this campaign. She considered it, and used little parts and didn't use others of some of that strategy. So that dynamic to me was fascinating. But the whole thing, I thought it brought out, in the end, I thought it brought out the best in the country. I thought after Obama had won, it brought out the best in many Republicans so far, and what we have seen about their comments and understanding of the historicism of what had occurred.
I was curious as well, in terms of, Hillary Clinton is now the Secretary of State. In terms of the way that the Clintons are dealing with that, Do you see her, do you think she'll be a successful Secretary of State, and do you think that she will be in some sort of simpatico with President Obama?
I'm not very good on predictions. I prefer the reporting parts. But I think that it's a smart choice from Obama's point of view. During the campaign, he was critical of her foreign policy credentials, and there's some reasons to be critical in a campaign environment of her credentials. They're not nearly so as extensive as some other candidates to be Secretary of State. However, what he has done here is he has really gotten two for the price of one. He has gotten both Clintons. You know, Bill Clinton really knows foreign policy. He has been the President of the United States. He has studied foreign policy. It is an area where he is strongest. And Bill and Hillary Clinton have had an uninterrupted dialogue for 30-some years now. Each looks at the other as the brightest star in the firmament, whatever their difficulties and problems. And he and Obama is going to be the beneficiary of that relationship. Whatever internal problems in the Clinton relationship there are, that's something else again. But Obama is really going to get the best out of Hillary and Bill Clinton. And rather than having them carping on the sidelines to nobody's benefit, look, she didn't want to go back to the Senate. She didn't want to be one of 100 senators. The Senate is the Congress of the United States is a horribly dysfunctional institution. The Senate a little less so than the House, perhaps. She was not going to be in a leadership position. And look, she is a huge star. And we live in a celebrity culture, not just in this country, but in the world today. That is her star power and Bill Clinton's star power are going to be great assets for this country and for Obama. The other thing that seems to me that she brings to the job has to do with Israel, the Palestinians, and the Middle East. Because Bill Clinton almost got a settlement. And here, too, he is going to, his credentials are going to count for something here, and her having gone through the experience of her husband, trying to hammer out that settlement when they thought they had a settlement with Arafat and the Israelis, it's key to what happens in the world, and that's going to be one of her priorities. And also, she's going to be part of the team. She really worked hard for Obama, and Bill was not quite on board. To the same degree that she was.
Yeah, that took some time. I'm wondering as well, what is your impression of Obama? I mean, people are saying by his cabinet picks that they see him as maybe being a centrist, ruling from the center. What is it about Obama that you think, maybe one or two capacities that he has that will make him perhaps one of our more unique presidents, other than the fact that he's African American?
I think that in fact, it's more than think. I talked to some of the people around him, and I think what the commentary has failed to understand so far about his cabinet choices is his desire to unite the country behind him. He is first and above all else a pol. He is a politician and a very successful one. He beat the greatest politicians in our business with very little experience, his own, with incredible discipline that he showed, and so that, no recent president has had the country really united behind him. And he knows that this is what he must do to be a different and more effective president, and to build a consensus. So what better way to do it than the people that we have seen him bring into his cabinet, particularly people like Jim Jones, Bob Gates from the previous administration. Some people on the left have expressed disappointment that there aren't more people from the left. He has many, quote, end quote, progressive inclinations. And what he said he wants to do in the campaign that very much is a progressive agenda in many ways. He intends to do, I believe. He doesn't need, I think, a lot of people coming in from the left to do that. He needs some cover, perhaps, for lack of a better word, center right. He's building a coalition very carefully. Also remember what he is up against in terms of what's going on in the world. We're in a depression. The technical term is a recession, but in many ways it more accurately can be described as a depression in terms of its long-term effects and prospects. It is a horrible situation. It's not just us, it's the rest of the world. It's going to go on for a good while. It changes all of the priorities of the presidency, of what he had intended and wanted to do. It has some silver linings to it. For instance, it means that spending on infrastructure, which would have been probably prohibited by a combination of conservative Democrats and Republicans, he now can do as a stimulus package. It means that health care reform becomes maybe more an accessible possibility of getting through the Congress than less.
One question that I had, just changing the subject a bit, is looking back on your original reporting with Bob Woodward, exposing Watergate in the early 70s. I'm wondering, how do you look back on that period of your career, and do you think it would be possible in this day and age, given the decline of newspapers and all the different types of media out there, to expose a similar scandal? Were you a young reporter today?
I think if history doesn't usually work, that you got to look at things in real time when they happened, etc. But there are plenty of really good reporters around, and there are still great newspapers that exist, even in this failing newspaper environment. The modern Washington Post, the modern New York Times, the modern Wall Street Journal are better newspapers today than the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal were at the time of Watergate. And there are plenty of good young reporters at those papers. And would they have those papers the courage to print the kind of stories with the kind of editorial leadership that Kay Graham did at the Washington Post and that the New York Times did during the Pentagon Papers? I think and hope the answer is yes. There are obviously some complicated factors about we live in a different time. You could spend hours on this question. That what happens in this, if you go back and you look at all the president's men, once we had the backing of the paper, which we had throughout, what really was keeping the truth from being known were the attacks on our credibility by the Nixon White House. The Nixon White House made our conduct in Watergate the issue rather than the conduct of the president and his men. And it worked for a very long time. The conduct of myself, Woodward, of Ben Bradley, of Katharine Graham at the Washington Post, conduct of the press. That still works. It might work more today in some regards if you look at what has happened through recent years, and that to me is the more difficult part of the equation, which is not that it couldn't get printed, but how people in the country would react to it. I think that might be a bigger problem. Getting people to get past the smokescreen of lies, deception, and mendacity by those in power. I mean, we've just seen, we're coming out of a presidential administration that the mendacity of this Bush presidency, its withholding of relevant information from the people and from the Congress of the United States has been grievous, has been egregious, has been in some regards worse in terms of its effect than the Nixon presidency. The Nixon presidency was a criminal presidency. Nixon was a constitutional criminal. Even the week that we're sitting here having this conversation, we've seen yet more tape conversations of President Nixon sitting there saying, I want you, to his aides, to firebomb the Brookings Institution, a think tank. Now, Woodward and I wrote that story. And I'll never forget it because I actually got the first report of it. And the person that told me about it said, yeah, they wanted to go in and make it look like a fire and bomb the place. And this is what the president wanted done. And he wanted his aide, Chuck Colson, to do it. So I called Colson, and Colson said to me, yeah, it's true, except what we really wanted to bomb was the Washington Post. And he made a joke out of it and then denied it. But I remember thinking, I mean, how can this be? The White House bombing a think tank. And obviously, in the Bush administration, we didn't have that. But what we have had is almost no straightforward truth-telling about the real policies in an administration that went to war and what the policies involved and how we went to war and how we were going to fight that war were, including the use of torture, promulgated by an Attorney General of the United States with the President's knowledge. You know, extraordinary things have happened in this presidency. And the great thing about it is, or about this situation is, that the press responded. Whatever the problems about failing to report enough on the likelihood that there was no WMD in Iraq, almost everything we know about the reality of the Bush presidency, we know from the press. We don't know it at all from any kind of oversight by the Congress of the United States. We don't know it from any kind of truth-telling by the Bush presidency. But the system failed in the Bush presidency. And the difference is it worked in the Nixon presidency. So the damage both to the world and to the country by the Bush presidency, it seems to me, is much greater than in the Nixon example. Because in Watergate, the press did its job. The judiciary did its job. A great judge, Sirica, put pressure on the Watergate conspirators and made them reveal some of what had happened. A great senator got the Senate of the United States, Republicans and Democrats, to conduct an investigation, you know, the Irvin Watergate Committee. Republicans joined Democrats in passing in the House Judiciary Committee articles of impeachment against the President of the United States. And then Barry Goldwater, the great Republican conservative, with a group of other Republicans, marched to the White House and said to Richard Nixon, you have to leave or we're going to vote to convict you. The system worked, and the Supreme Court of the United States said no one is above the law, including the President of the United States, and ordered Nixon to turn over his tapes. Well, nothing like that has happened in the Bush presidency, and that's the difference.
Are you worried about, I mean, we saw it in the Valerie Plame case where, again, the use of anonymous sources, the press is under perhaps more stress today. I mean, you guys famously used Deep Throat Mark Felt. Is that something that you're concerned about, that there will not be enough, shield laws for journalists that can reliably use anonymous sources?
I never used to believe in shield laws, and because I didn't think they were necessary, and I thought that the First Amendment is pretty much absolute, and it says Congress shall make no laws abridging freedom of speech, press, etc., and I take it at its word, but I think now they are necessary. I think that there are problems. One, that sometimes reporters and newspapers abuse the use of anonymous sources, and it gets us into trouble in terms of people saying, well, why do these yokels have this privilege to begin with? At the same time, look, almost everything we know in terms of the really important stories, whether it's about the mayor, the Bush presidency, a football team, they come from anonymous sources. Part of the reason is that I've come to believe that there is such people don't get to make honest mistakes as much anymore in our culture as they once did. So that in itself, so that the consequences of making a mistake in our culture are huge. People lose their jobs. People are ridiculed. The press goes after them. They lose money. So it used to be you could learn from making mistakes. I don't think that mistakes are quite as permissible. So the result is people don't tell the truth as often. And certainly on the record, forget about it. So there's no other way usually to get, but you know, this goes back, the idea that this is something new. When Woodward and I wrote the final days, about the final days of the Nixon presidency, and we wrote about Nixon and Kissinger down on their knees praying together, and you know, and all the things you've seen in the tapes since about Nixon using anti-Semitic slurs and being dangerously unstable and talking about possibility of committing suicide and drinking and all the rest. Many of our colleagues said, how can you put that in the book? It's all based on anonymous sources, just like the reporting was in the paper in the first place. And how can that be credible? And you're going to hurt all of us in the profession by doing it. And I remember we were asked that on Meet the Press. And I brought with me a great book about Roosevelt's packing of the Supreme Court, published in 1940, as I recall, and written by Joe Alsop, then a great Washington journalist, and Turner Catledge, who went on to become the managing editor of the New York Times, a very dramatic account of the packing of the court. All with anonymous sources. And I pulled it up on Meet the Press and I started to read it. And I said, there's nothing new about this, guys. Yeah. Good stories, this is often how it's been done, going way back. It's the way you have to get the story. And you know, so I think that there's too much hand-wringing about anonymous sources. The difference is that the Supreme Court decided in a case called Brandsburg versus the New York Times that there is no absolute privilege for the press. In fact, there really isn't a privilege. And so therefore, reporters can be jailed for not revealing their sources. It seems to me that what we need are sensible prosecutors who don't abuse that ruling, and so far there have been too many prosecutors who aren't sensible.
I think maybe my last question for you would be, given the success of your unauthorized Hillary Clinton biography, are there any other subjects that you would like to do a biography on? I mean, Obama would be an obvious example, but is there anyone else out there that might fascinate you in the same way?
Well, if you look at the themes of all of my books and Bob's books and our books together, they're all about the use and abuse of power. You know, I did a biography of Pope John Paul II, the Nixon books, obviously, but you know, here's power, spiritual power of the Pope, Nixon, Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton. So that's what and then I wrote a memoir about my family called Loyalties, about growing up in a left-wing family during the McCarthy power and about the misuse of government power in that horrible time against people like my parents who were left-wing people. And so that's been the constant theme. At the same time, it's funny, you know, I also was a rock critic. And at the Washington Post. And just today I was talking to a friend, you know, I would really love to write a biography of somebody in music, either classical music or rock and roll. When I did the book on Hillary, I cast about looking for a book on somebody in music. And part of the problem is on the major rock and roll figures, there are really some great biographies. There's a great Elvis biography, Peter Gromit. There's a very good Ray Charles biography. The Dylan biographies and autobiographies are certainly covered. Anyway, I'm looking at it. Daniel Barenboim has just published an autobiography or a memoir He's a classical musician that really interests me. But I think it would be fun to do a biography in a different realm. In terms of power, I have a project in mind that I think I want to do as a documentary film rather than as a book. I think that it might be that you can have, if you do it right, a little more impact right now in this culture through a documentary film. I'd like to try a different form. I like to change a little bit and do new things.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Good to be here. Thanks.
All right, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.